Hello and welcome back for another Sheriff Custodian video. Today I'm going to share the remarks that I gave at my school's Alpha Omega Alpha induction ceremony. If anyone out there is unaware, Alpha Omega Alpha, or AOA, is the Medical School Honor Society. It's a big deal to get selected, and it was a big deal to get to speak to this group of students. I don't share every talk that I give, in part because the talks that I create are specifically intended for that audience. I really want to speak to that particular group. But this talk I decided to share because I think that I get up to a point that other people will benefit from hearing. So here you go. It really is an honor to get to speak with you all on such an exciting day. If you didn't know it already, I'm here to tell you, to be elected to AOA is a high honor. Many of our nation's most important and influential physicians are AOA members, from Jonas Salk to Anthony Fauci. Matter of fact, around 75% of medical school deans are members of AOA. 60% of all U.S. surgeons general have been AOA members. There are 57 AOA members, 57 who are Nobel laureates. And somehow, out of all these eminent and accomplished individuals, you picked me to give your speech today. Well, don't worry, you too can go on to have a very illustrious medical career. You're just going to have to work on your judgment. So tonight's really a night that's about you. It's a chance to celebrate your accomplishments. And so I'd like to begin that celebration by talking about me. I'm kind of a private person. I don't usually share a lot of personal stuff, but tonight I'm going to tell you a little bit about my background. I'm going to tell you a little bit about who I am and where I came from and how I used to see myself. Some of my story might resonate with some of you. And even if it doesn't, I hope you'll bear with me because I'm building to something. I'm going to get to a point that's actually very, very important for each of you as new members of AOA to hear. But let's get back to me. So, who am I? Well, 250 years ago, my mother's ancestors arrived from England and they started making their way west. They made it to the very northwest corner of North Carolina, and that's where they stopped. They were farmers, and I sometimes wondered why they stopped there because the winters get cold and the soil is shallow and flat land is hard to come by. But I thought about the realities of travel back in those days. I mean, it was hard to travel overland on flat ground. It was even harder up an unforgiving grade. So I think when they saw White Top Mountain, which is a mountain that reaches over 5,500 feet, over a mile in elevation, when they saw that looming in the distance, they said, you know what, we're just going to stay here. And they farmed the land and they eked out a living in that general area for centuries. Now, I personally grew up in a little town called Richlands, Virginia. It's located in the very southwest corner of Virginia, over a couple of mountain ridges from where my mother's family is originally from. Culturally, it's a little different because the town sits on this rich seam of bituminous coal. So it's a coal mining town. Now, one of the earliest memories that I honestly truly remember with great clarity came when I was about 5 years old, and we won a set of World Book Encyclopedias in a raffle. You got to remember, this was a pre-internet era. You couldn't just Google up things you wanted to know. There was a premium on factual knowledge that you stored in your brain, and there was therefore a premium on books that you could use to transfer that valuable knowledge into your brain. And I loved looking through those encyclopedias. The main reason I did was probably because of my dad, who would get up on Saturday mornings and turn through the pages to look up things that piqued his curiosity during the week. It was from him that I learned to love reading and learning. I went to the local public schools. Now, the schools in my town are not necessarily what many would consider good schools. From my high school, less than a quarter of the graduating class went on to a four-year college. But the schools there were good enough. If you cared about being a good student, and make no mistake, I did, you could learn a thing or two. I played sports too. I loved to play basketball. Wasn't a very good athlete. Couldn't run especially fast. I certainly couldn't jump. But I was a good shooter because I practiced a lot, and that allowed me to fill a certain niche on the team. I ran track too, and I qualified for the state tournament mainly because I didn't miss practices and I wasn't afraid to push myself. And not to toot my own horn, I was a good student. I made it through high school without making anything less than an A. I wrote my reports using those old 1986 World Book Encyclopedias. I finished at the top of my class and I was offered a couple of academic scholarships to college. In college, I continued to work hard and I graduated second in my class. If not for a couple of questions on one physics exam, I might have finished first. I went to medical school, and in matter of fact, I was selected to AOA. Um, by that point in my life, I'd won a good number of different awards, and making AOA kind of mattered to me because it felt like it was honoring something that I really believed in. If you read the mission statement of AOA, it says the organization is dedicated to the belief that in the profession of medicine, we will improve care for all by recognizing high educational achievement. It mentions some other things, but the first thing is just that we'll improve care for everyone by recognizing high educational achievement. And I wanted that to be true because that was a big part of my personal ethos. When you grow up and you look at yourself in the mirror, you develop a certain self-image, a certain set of beliefs about who you are and what you're good at, even if you don't always honestly share it with others. And for a certain time in my life, my narrative was this. I was smart. I knew I was a quick learner, but I was also not a wimp. I wasn't afraid to work hard. I saw myself as a child of a blue-collar, coal-mining town, as the descendant of farmers who'd scratched together a living by coaxing crops out of the Appalachian mountainsides. I had worked hard to achieve in school, and I believed that by doing so, I was going to help my patients and make the world a better place. And I know that all of you have different life stories, but I'll bet you that there are some similarities between mine and yours, at least in the way you view yourself. But the thing I want to emphasize here is this. When I looked at myself, when I thought about myself, I'll tell you what I didn't see. I definitely did not see myself as someone who'd been handed anything. I did not believe that I'd achieved anything that I had because I'd received some kind of unfair advantage. Through my eyes, I'd worked hard and I'd earned every bit of it. But sometimes things don't look the same looking backward as they do looking forward. Sometimes you notice things. You notice things that were there all along, but once you notice them, it changes the way you see it. I told you about the town I grew up in. Well, one thing about growing up there at that time was this. The whole time that I attended Richlands Elementary, Middle, and High School, there were zero black students in my class. Zero. When I traveled around to other places, I could easily see that most towns were more diverse than mine. From time to time, I wondered why. It wasn't until I'd grown up and moved away that I learned some of my town's history. In 1893, Richlands was the site of a well-publicized lynching. 5 black men were murdered by a mob estimated to include 500 to 800 people. And that was just the first of several well-publicized acts of racial violence that served to enforce a boundary at the edge of the coalfields. I told you that I played basketball in high school. We played basketball games against several local rivals who used the nickname Rebels. Actually, some still do. So when you opening tip-off, you'd be standing on top of this giant Confederate flag painted on the floor at center court. Fans were often waving their own Confederate flags. When I was a kid, I used to just see that as school spirit. I see it differently now. I went to college at Washington and Lee University. I told you that I received a full academic scholarship. I didn't mention that that particular scholarship was named after General Robert E. Lee himself. When we had university assemblies, we did them in Lee Chapel, and behind the speaker's podium was this statue of the recumbent Robert E. Lee. Many people, when they see it, they mistake it for Lee's sarcophagus. And when I was a student there, again, I never thought much about this. I went to medical school in Charlottesville. In my spare time, I'd run around town. There was this big statue in the center of town that I'd run by. To me, it was just a convenient mile marker because I passed it around the 2 mile mark of my usual route. It wasn't until a decade after I finished medical school that I saw national newscasts broadcasting live footage of white supremacists surrounding that statue with torches and Nazi flags that I thought about what that statue symbolized for others. I did my residency here at EVMS. When I came, I was struck by how much the neighborhoods changed as you moved north from 21st Street across the railroad tracks. It was only later that I learned about redlining, the practice of color coding neighborhoods on maps that were distributed by the governments to mortgage lenders. White neighborhoods got colored green or blue, signifying that they were a safe investment. Black neighborhoods were highlighted in red, and they got little investment because they were deemed too high risk. If you're interested, you can Google up the redlining maps of Norfolk, but honestly, you don't need to. If you've lived here for a year or two, you could probably draw it by hand just by how those neighborhoods look 75 years later. I went back to Charlottesville for my fellowship in pediatric nephrology. My office was in the basement of an older building across the street from the gleaming University Hospital. Going to my office was dreary. The hallways were narrow. The ceilings were low hanging and they had exposed wires and pipes, and the rooms were small and windowless. I'll tell you, I had a lot of good jokes about how my office was in the dungeon. Those jokes became not so funny when I later learned that the basement that I worked in used to be the colored wing of the hospital. The building itself is still named after an old dean of the medical school who was an outspoken segregationist and eugenicist. When I finished up my fellowship, I returned to practice here at EVMS, and I remember a little girl came to see me. She was about to enter the ninth grade, and we started chit-chatting. She was so excited about starting high school, and she'd come to the appointment with her grandmother, and her grandmother shared with me how she herself had been so excited to go to high school some decades before. Only she told me she didn't get to go to high school because that's when they closed the schools. I didn't know what she was talking about. Close the schools? I said. And if you don't know what she's talking about, it's this. After Brown versus Board of Education, the federal government declared that states could no longer segregate their public schools. But in Virginia, some lawmakers saw a loophole. They wouldn't have to segregate the public schools if there were no public schools to segregate. So around here, the public schools were closed. Some new private schools opened up to accommodate the white, middle, and upper class children. There was a whole generation that was lost educationally. And this was just one policy among many in the political movement called massive resistance, which was intended to maintain racial segregation. Some of you may think I'm sharing all this just to show you how woke I am, and if that's the message you're taking, you're missing the point. Some others may think that me sharing this really just proves how ignorant and oblivious I am. And if that's the message that you've taken, I've got to say that's a fair criticism. So I hope you can look past me and my own personal experiences and see the bigger point, which is that we live in a world in which racism and prejudice shape lots of things all around us. I hope we can agree on that much, because in the big scheme of things, many of the examples that I've shared aren't even the most important ones. But once you look around and you start to see how bigotry and intolerance shape things, you can't unsee it. And you shouldn't try. And that brings me to AOA. AOA was started in 1902 at the medical school that ultimately came to be known as the University of Illinois Chicago. Within a couple of years, they had AOA chapters at the University of Chicago and at Northwestern. A few years after that, AOA had spread to medical schools in other states. The history of AOA thereafter could be briefly summarized as unbridled expansion as new AOA chapters popped up, along with new medical schools all over the country. That changed a few years ago. In 2018, the Mount Sinai School of Medicine dropped their AOA chapter. Later, UCSF followed suit. Many other schools are actively considering doing the same. Why? Well, in 2017, there was this paper that got published in JAMA Internal Medicine. The authors analyzed students in the class of 2015 who'd been elected to AOA, and they found that, compared to a white male reference group, even after multivariable adjustment, women had 20% lower odds for getting into AOA. Hispanic and Asian medical students had 50% lower odds compared to whites. And black medical students were nearly 15 times less likely to get into AOA. I bring this up with you because this is a problem that each of you all, as new members of AOA, will have to reckon with. It's touchy to talk about this, in part because when you do, some people will mistake what you're saying. They'll think that what you're saying is that they don't deserve to be here. And I hope that none of you are mistaking what I'm saying to you tonight. So let me be clear. You deserve to be here. I know several of you personally. You're the rock stars of EVMS. You're the elite among an already elite group. Working to ensure that we have equitable processes doesn't take away anything from you. It doesn't diminish your accomplishments, not one bit. Every obstacle that you overcame to get here, you overcame it. You were the one who wrote the paper. You were the one who gave the presentation or took the test. You were the one who was taking a practice MCAT while your friends were throwing a frisbee in the quad. You were the one studying in the middle of the night in Brickell Library because you knew that someday soon, someone's life might depend on it. You deserve all the credit in the world for what you've accomplished. The only thing I'll say is that it's easy to see and remember the obstacles that were in your path. It's harder to see the ones that were never there in the first place. And I hope that, regardless of whatever else you take from my words tonight, you spend a few minutes thinking about that. Symbol of AOA is the key. In many ways, that's an appropriate metaphor because your selection to this organization is going to unlock certain doors in your own career, just like it did for some of the illustrious figures that I mentioned at the beginning of this talk. Of course, locks and keys don't just let certain people in, they also keep others out. I still believe the mission statement of AOA is fundamentally true. I do believe that medicine is better off and that we'll improve care by recognizing high educational achievement. I truly believe that the hard work that you've put in as a medical student is going to make things better for your patients. I want that to be an accomplishment that you can always celebrate. But for that to be the case, we got to do better. We cannot let AOA be an extension of the deeply entrenched and deeply flawed systems that create obstacles and limit opportunities for certain groups while perpetuating advantage for others. We need to think carefully about how we recognize merit and how we can make that process more fair and equitable, even in a society and educational system in which most things are decidedly neither. So in closing, I'm going to stop talking about me and get back to you because you are the real stars tonight. I hope you're proud to be here. I hope you're impressed by your own accomplishments because I sure am. Congratulations and welcome to AOA. May you all leave it better than you found it. That's all.